Well, hello, good morning. Welcome to this almost last day of the colloquium of 17 Institute of Critical Studies Against Perfection for a non-eugenic future. In this occasion, this morning, we have Sergio Villalobos-Ruminott. He's in Michigan, in the United States. Rossana Reguillo. And Milton Reynolds will be commenting their presentations. Eugenics, right wing, left wing. What the intention of this panel is to put into play the topic of the colloquium in this particular conversation line, which is more political, ideological, and see if in this perspectives, in these imaginariums, the topic of eugenics has a particular nuance. So I think it's a quite provocative topic. Usually we would understand eugenics as policies, as conservative policies from right wing or left wing or ultra right wing, but not necessarily historically, according to what we can document. By the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and on this current moment where fascism are waking up again in both areas, in the right wing and left wing. So without further ado, I would like to present the commentator and the presenters. All of you have between 20-25 minutes for your presentation, and then we will have around 30 minutes for Q&A sessions, for a Q&A session here with the audience, both here in Mexico City, in San Ildefonso, as well as with people who are following through social networks and the YouTube transmission. So, Sergio Villalobos-Ruminott, he's a PhD in Latin American Studies by the Pittsburgh University. He's professor of Latin American literature in the Michigan University. He's author of a number of texts, among which we can call Sovereignties in Suspense and in Latin America. And about fascism, he has studied sociology in Chile. Rossana Reguillo, she's a researcher in social sciences. She's a Mexican activist focused on youngsters' violences and social fears from an interdisciplinary perspective that goes between anthropology, communication, and social studies. Part of her academic path throughout the last years has been focused on violence and forced disappearance in Mexico, and she has been acknowledged with the Ibero-American Award of regional research, as well as an award in anthropology. From the Bay of San Francisco, we have Milton Reynolds. He's a researcher, and his work is focused on history and inheritances, the contemporary inheritances of eugenics, and how eugenics rationale has influenced public policies and racial practices, particularly regarding disabilities, health, and social control. From a critical perspective and also an interdisciplinary perspective, his work contributes to the current debates about memory, ethics, and persistence of eugenics in the current societies. So thanks to all the presenters, and we will start, Sergio, with you. Well, originally I was going to talk about a displace from whiteness as it was developed by Bolivar Echeverria, this Ecuadorian Mexican philosopher, really an interesting work he has done so far, up to what we call speculative whiteness. following the publication of Jordan Carroll book that speaks about speculative whiteness in the context of the development of new ways of thinking, of reactionary thinking to versus the alt-right in the United States. Before that, I would like to focus on the central question, which is understanding eugenics from the face of right wing, left wing. I don't have an answer. I wouldn't dare to respond or to give a categorical response, but I have an hypothesis, a little bit negative hypothesis. I will try to explain it with a couple of epigraphs taken directly from Being and Time from Heidegger. From the existential analyticus, the first paragraphs, Heidegger says, most important than a fact is possibility. More important than facts is the possibility. And that's fundamental because that contributes for existential analytics. It's something that it's not closed. It's intertwined by its constitution towards constitution. Maybe it's not our concept of future, and it's important to say so. It has to do with, for example, what Derrida would call the becoming. This time that could come or could not come, like the potentiality of Agamben. So rather than a factuality, it's the openness, it's the non-closed experience of time. However, during the 1970s, Gunther Anders, that was Gunther Stein, but since he was Jewish, he changed his name because Anders, it's like another Jew. He was the first husband of Hannah Arendt. He has a systemic work about the obsolescence of men and atomic bomb in a book that's called Atomic Threats. It's a second epigraph that I would like to put across. It's the possibility of our extinction. The possibility of our extinction is radically the extinction of all our possibilities. So you notice how the epigraph is completely different to what Heidegger said. For Heidegger, factuality is not at the same level as possibility because possibility is more important because that's the structure that closes factuality. For Anders, he's thinking about it in context of war, of what is obvious here is a change in the regime of understanding and the end. It's our relationship with ends, and that's technologically mediated. So the possibility of our extension is the extension of our possibilities. Why? Because that finitude is no longer a possibility. It's more like a death sentence in the face of technologically secured scientists. So why all this is relevant for me? I think we are at a historical moment of absolute threat. The world is divided between two types of right wing. We don't have the historical force of an articulated left wing with a program, with a plan. What we have right now is two types of right wing. One right wing that's neoliberal, traditional, that brings together conservatism, patrimonialism, and an aggressive right, neo-imperial right wing, sustained technologically and in an imaginary, illiberal. So it's an imaginary that goes beyond liberalism. It's not an ultra-liberalism, it's not even neoliberalism, it's more like a cancellation of the model of capitalist modernity and neoliberal modernity where we are used to. So it's in this context that I would like to inscribe my intervention. Bolivar Echeverria was one of the Latin American politics that link together the colonial capitalist along with the realist ethos with the formation of societies in Latin America. He inscribed in the heart of the project, of the capitalist project, the racial factor along with whiteness or the whitening as long as discipline of the vernacular groups, speaking about, well, whiteness on an understanding that it was a productive understanding, that is, capitalism is structurally a practice of racialization or of racial practice, as Daniel Nelson would say. Race is not a superstructure along with the capitalist accumulation. It's an infrastructure of capitalism. Capitalism operates by through race, through eugenics, by programming, the modeling, and the productive determination of men or of humanity. However, the scope of the interrogation of Bolivar Echeverria about whiteness is not just on the realm of the Baroque, of the Latin American Baroque. Precisely because the dynamics themselves are evident in the manifestations of what we could call the contemporary imperial reason. I'm talking about modernity and whiteness. This is an intensifying of the hypothesis of Echeverria, and that's why I would like to interrogate what Jordan Carroll called speculative whiteness, where on one hand we have the supremacism of neo-fascism, and on the other hand, we have the alt-right of the United States, along with the imagination that comes with reactionary science fiction. I'm going to focus on certain literary imagination practices that we usually call science fiction, but I'm going to prove that the science fiction is no longer what it used to be. Science fiction is no longer the secondary is no longer on a secondary place, pre-political, that had during the current social contract. Science fiction is no longer about a dystopian future, but at a catastrophic present. Actually, in Latin America, we talk about post-apocalyptic science fiction. During the 1980s, this was mentioned. An author was telling us is that science fiction is a new realism, and this is quite interesting because what it's sustaining is that science fiction is no longer an allegory of the dystopic future or an ending of history. It's more today more like a critical elaboration of the catastrophe that is occurring before our eyes. We can think about, just to give a very obvious example, Agustin Abasterrica in this topic of an anthropophagic dystopia, but it's also a national allegory about the consumption of meat in the Argentinian terrains, the disputes for the land, the representation of gauchos, and meat consumption. So it's this idea, a new relationship with contemporary time. So when Carroll speaks about contemporary whiteness or speculative whiteness, it's not just a literary exercise through science fiction. Here the production is interesting because this science fiction is reactionary and it's characterized by a very profound white supremacism, by a techno-racial and transhumanist logic. I'm sorry because of these words, but these are the words that are part of this current divide. Techno-racial debate. What I want to show is this configuration of a techno-racial configuration as a constant of the Western imperialism. And of course, this techno-racialism has a role in transhumanism, and we have right-wing and left-wing transhumanism, and debates go on and on. And speculation also, it's infinite. But besides that, science fiction or reactionary science fiction is characterized by what we called is archaeofuturism. That is the representation of future as a realization of an archaic or a repressed origin. So reactionary science fiction, what we find is the final consolidation of a white civilization that finally takes off all these limitations or all obstacles for its own realization. Among other obstacles, they take away all of the demographies that contaminate the white supremacist model. So this archaeofuturism, it's different because the future is the realization of this repressed future. Archaeofuturism has a philosophical element. It's the metaphysical element, what Heidegger and Derrida called the archaeoteleological creation of the metaphysical reality. That dimension that is in the origin, we have the display and the realization of the metaphysical project. In terms of science fiction, which is like a small sister, science fiction is like a branch of metaphysics. But in terms of science fiction, it becomes an archaeofuturism, that is a willing for a future, which is a realization of a repressed white future. Archaeoteleologism is relevant because it's a final articulation of a white scientific and interplanetary white civilization. Think about all this Silicon Valley imaginary of the interplanetary conquest and so forth. It's not a coincidence that all of this constitutes a reflexive horizon of what I would call a new avant-garde, techno-Caesarian avant-garde. This will be the political aspect. A new techno-Caesarian avant-garde that will be located or hosted, so to speak, in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley would be the places where all this new techno-Caesarian avant-garde is articulated. So I'm trying to take this suspicion of believer that goes hand in hand with Marx and the critical of the determination of men or humanity or humans within the classical philosophy, even with Heidegger and the determination of men in the letters of humanism image of the world. But I liked Echeverria better because he embodies this idea of whiteness, performance, this racializing performance of the current capitalism. In his current work of Carroll's, it's speculative whiteness science fiction in the alt-right. He interrogates the structural convergence between North American science fiction. He's talking about Jerry Burnell, Larry Millen, Frank Herbert, Robert Spaniard, John Campbell, and certain activist groups, the Radic Poppies, and things like that. He brings all this together in what he calls the general horizon of the neo-reactionary way of thinking, specifically of this new avant-garde, this neo-Caesarian avant-garde, which is the ethnic land, like Curtis Jarvin, Knapp from Technological Republic, the CEO of Palantir, Peter Thiel, of course, with his reading of the problem of Antichrist. And of course, this science fiction is different. For example, different science fictions like Michel Houellebecq or Bolaño or Benjamin Lamatut. It's relevant not just because of its speculative content or its imagination. I think that will be too poor to understand it. We could say it's a bad quality, a reactionary science fiction. It doesn't have so much speculation or imagination. There's not a lot of work or anthropological works with the language, but there they put into place a conception of history, a vulgar conception of history, we could say, that is transversal to the imaginarium of the new alt-right. Through the vulgarity of science, of the reactionary science fiction, we can understand the temporality that's articulating the projects of the new alt-right. In the realm of alt-right science fiction, where of course, Octavia Butler and Ursula K. Le Guin all have no place, which is the post-apocalyptic Latin American science fiction, to speak about the science fiction in the place of the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union science fiction, which is more complex in that regard. This North American science fiction is characterized by certain elements that repeat themselves. The appropriation of science fiction, which is a product of a fundamentally white imagination. They say only white people can imagine in scientific and technological terms. Also, the exclusivity of this white imagination in terms of technological development. That is, they believe that only white people are prepared to do so because they have a long time processing compared to other traditions or other civilizations or directly other races like Latin, Black, etc. The, that they have emerged in other spaces and they don't have a long time processes, so they are more hedonistic, least sacrificial, or they less ascetic. And that, of course, is the result of philosophical anthropology, that is, a philosophical representation of men and white men. In science fiction, it's obvious, but it's not only part of science fiction, it's part of the tradition of the of the Western philosophical way of thinking. This is a place where science fiction and its representation, that of white supremacism, shows an ontological constitutive logic in the Western way of thinking, and we can verify that in the determination of black as a subhuman species in Kant, in the observations of human about the beauty and the sublime, and also the consideration of the peoples without history of Hegel, or what Freud would call the savage villages that are not able to create a transference, or villages without capability of logical rationalization. So we have an ontological racism that is absolutely obvious in the reactionary science fiction. Three, and this is quite important right now, the dissolution of the border between the speculation of the neo-reactionary science fiction and the essays of the reactionary science fiction. Reactionary science fiction and its political essays are hard to be distinguished. It's hard to say if they are science fiction novels. There's like a permeation of constant contamination between what you can imagine and what you can aspire politically. So this means that reactionary science fiction is something like a metapolitics. And here the central concept is the created by Nick Lamb through hyperstation. It's a concept that basically means the capability of science fiction to program political results in an anticipated fashion, the general logic of contamination or cross-contamination. And finally, what we said before, the fourth element, which is an archaeofuturism, the inevitable technological dominion of the white race as a realization of a project that was originally created on the singularity on this onto-anthropology of whiteness. Now, what I am interested in through this perspective is not just the appropriation of the genre or the expressions, the literary expressions of their practitioners. What I'm interested here is the philosophical anthropology it's at the core of this display, an anthropology that not only implies a technological perspective of humanity, but also a configuration of the types of humanities with a historical reading that privileges a specific representation of the potential civilization powers of whiteness. So we have two constant elements of Western way of thinking, the philosophical and anthropological element, and also the political historical aspect. So we have techno-anthropology and philosophy of history that it's at the core of supremacism. So it's not enough to criticize supremacism as a new fascist error or as getting lost in intellectuality. Um, we have to show that techno-racism is the ending or the conclusion of a structural process of determination that it's hosted on Western way of thinking. This is maybe what Afro-pessimists insist on, or what they call the ontological limit of the modern rationality. This ontological limit of current rationality is the impossibility of including blackness or the black person in the concept of humanity, not only in Kant but also in the liberal tradition in general. So, well, I would like to interrupt myself.
I would just like to highlight the speculative whiness aspect of things, right? And so it's way too easy. So criticizing writers because they're too easy, then that's too, that they're part of it is too easy. So we need to think about authors like Langford and Peter Field and among others, and they are not in the same level of fiction, but instead in philosophical anthropology that is feeding them and suppose as its own condition a determined representation of history and its realization. So in other words, I think that the speculative whiness actually is the most vulgar articulation and presents a series of analytic decisions that feed this humanism perspective based on contemporary measures. And it has determined the configuration of a cybernetic rationality that can replace simply modern aspects, the auto representation of history or the man. So here it includes cybernetics. And I think that this is the name of a practice of systemic self-reference that will then be displaying the human aspect and can open the possibility for transhumanism and contemporary post-humanism. And so some of these are the critics to classic humanism. Actually, within the contemporary and post-humanism, usually they are perceived as hopeless, and that can be the core battlefield, for example, in people such as Rossana and some others. So all of that deserves a lot of clarifications. But what I am very interested in is showing that in the configuration of science, technological rationality, and also cybernetic, there is a suppression of human mediation, of human agency. That is through this configuration of a systemic self-reference. So this was called autopoiesis, right? So this is actually not Viller, and he was the founder, but instead Luhmann, when he systematizes this idea, it's incorporated in a post-illustrated theory, and so then it goes to, on the one hand, Gregory Bateson, right? And so what Gregory Bateson was calling ecology of the mind, but on the other hand, he also goes to some Chilean biologist, Mr. Burana, for example, to be able to work with this concept of autopoiesis. So that is so crucial, and it is crucial because autopoiesis or self-poiesis, for example, mostly when it's systematic, supposes the elimination of human mediation. It supposes the superation of Aristotle's poiesis as the imaginary, and it also is thinking about poiesis, and this is a performance of the system, but it is also getting rid of any type of possibility of resistance and all the value of content of the resistance and fight, because everything can be also used in terms of input, feedback from the system. So this is actually the whole contribution. And here, what I'm very interested in mentioning is a book that is fundamental for me in this context, which is a book from an American professor that is called Roger Julie, and the book is called Sentient Flesh. And so what this author is talking about is he is referring to it as black poiesis. So parasemiosis and black poiesis. And so this is interesting because what he is saying against this notion of this reference of self-poiesis, but also as productivity of a metaphysic aspect that is transcending, he's referring to the little systematic aspect of this that is scattered, let's say, of a practice of resistance, but it's also a black imaginary practice. And imaginary precisely because of the condition in respect to the modern horizon. So in that sense, this poiesis, this black poiesis that he refers to, is the poetic poiesis of romantic Germans, for example, because it's not systematic, right? So there is no cultural semiosis that is closed symbolically, but instead is a parasemiosis. So what he is questioning or asking is what we are referring to a while ago about the capacity of black poiesis to produce iterations and to have this eventful thinking. That is to say that under improvisation, we are trying to think. That's basically what it refers to. And that is why it's so important, because this figure of black poiesis is not a theory of the poem of art or transcendental imagination, but instead is a minimum variation of resistance and also the events and mundane intelligence that are opposing to the systematic closure of metaphysics. And that, I think that is also very interesting. I think I still, how long do I have left? Actually, we need to close, please, Sergio. Okay, so, well, simply I would just like to say that what I think is that the general horizon and, well, the consequences that probably I would like you to take with this is we are in a geopolitical transformation moment. This is not something that depends on the schizophrenic occurrence of a world leader that is a narcissist, but instead there is a plan on the planet, and this plan is deeply consistent and coherent, and we can see that there are some elements of racist self-technology, so to speak, that is also supremacist. And it is not a coincidence. It is not casual that the imperial colonial Western project that is presented today beyond the NATO and some of the agreements and also all of this has been happening since Second World War. Now it is expressed as a configuration of a multipolar order, but it is not a coincidence that that is actually convergent with this project of racial cleaning that the people are imagining the recovery, the sovereign recovery of the territory in America. So that is not a casualty, a coincidence that is, or is not casual. And so in that sense, there is an imperial eugenics or ontological eugenics that has always been operating and that we, I think, need to better understand to be able to criticize it. So I will leave it there because I think I just wanted to introduce those topics. So thank you. Thank you, Sergio. So, Rossana, we continue with you, please. Hi, hello, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure for me to be here. Thank you so much for Institute 17. It's always a pleasure to be able to debate and think as well with you. And I really appreciate this invitation because it really opened a space for me for a very long time, actually, that where I have been thinking about eugenics from different perspectives. I actually started thinking about these things during long-term research for Latin America that I called social construction of fear, where I was interested, and actually this research started in 1998 when, let's say that there was a certain optimism that the world could be inclusive and that globalization would then bring advantages of a fully integrated world. And so some colleagues were saying that I was totally crazy, but I started finding fundamental things. So, for example, the presence of a very strong eugenic device that has been installed even from the times of the colonies, etc., but it would still be there, regardless of the ideologic perspective of the governments that were on office, for example. So, for example, there I could find the persistence of these eugenics project, Italian specifically, in its distribution, for example, in Latin America. So that happened through, for example, the a book of the criminal mind, and actually that is a canonic book with which even in progressist governments, the police officers are still trained on. So this is definitely a book that is very deceitful, and it was built from scientificist logic, where the population that was analyzed was people that were incarcerated, etc. So they created this idea of the internal enemy that has sustained and has managed to somehow survive this logic, right? And so I like the idea of the project that Sergio is proposing as a project that, let's say, that overflows that category of the right wing and the left wing, right? So I want to probably think about this more as something that has been keeping the control, even schizophrenically, over populations. So it was a time where I really studied a lot the presence of these eugenics project in Colombia, in Peru, in Ecuador, with fundamental authors, fundamental books as well. And especially there is a Mexican author that afterwards she stopped publishing and she did an amazing work. It was Alejandra Stern. She actually worked on this idea of mestizophilia as precisely a device, so to speak, to be able to erase what I called these stains of the indigenous people. So these mistophilia that try to erase all of that problematic past. So, for example, I found that it was until 1983 that Dominicans, for example, could acknowledge themselves in their matrix, Spanish matrix, instead of recognizing themselves from their Ethiopian matrix. And I also found that Dominicans would deport people from Haiti because they were blacker, let's say. And I found jokes. I mean, there was a lot of empirical evidence, ethnographically speaking, and also analytically speaking, some dimensions that really made me think about this huge difficulty of assuming a non-eugenic future. I mean, usually I am an optimist, and my friends and my colleagues say that I am actually a closet optimist, or that I'm hiding. But actually, now I feel a very big concern about what is happening. So I prepared this very briefly. Please just let me know when I am getting to my 25-minute mark so that I am not going over time. So I prepared just a very small presentation so that I could help and try to communicate better. So the idea would be to start with this pendulum of eugenics and to try to figure out this question whether there is a specific logic or a specific rationale for left wing and for right wing, and instead to think a little bit more about how eugenics is going between a pendulum between governments that call themselves progressive with progressive projects and authoritarian ones, because this is a constitutive matrix, culturally speaking, right? So that is what we are fighting against, and I think that sometimes that is not really understood or is not really seen. So I would like to start when I received this invitation. I don't really know why or what is the reason, but this invitation and also this proposal of thinking about these topics immediately took me to a book that Ellen Terrain published in 1997, and it was called Could We Live Together, Equal and Different? So I think that question is still very pertinent. Maybe not anymore from the multiculturalism that Terrain was considering at the time, but precisely taking into consideration the gap that was open between the lives that matter and also how this logic is being reconfigured in terms of selection of lives. And I am I think that it's actually very important. I'm in Mexico and I'm working with a lot of issues of violence and forced disappearances, etc. So this idea of eugenics as dispositive of this control, I think, is super fundamental. So I think that this question that Doreen is asking is placing us once again in a very complex dilemma, because let's say that we are also seeing some very deep expressions of cruelty, some deep expressions of savagism, where it is very, very hard for us to really think about an inclusion that has no conditions. So I believe that this is very complex. Likewise, I thought about how COVID, right, the COVID pandemic opened what my colleague Aliga Peña and I have called the COVID Pantone. So this is a chromatic regime of bodies that have been rationalized, impoverished, vaccines that were also provided selectively, also access to hospitals selectively, people that had certain professions that couldn't stop, for example, to be able to keep a certain order, and how this logic of the COVID Pantone managed or made it that a lot of the deaths were assumed. That is, it was necessary for those people to die. But what I'm more interested about on thinking about these things from these eugenic elements, undoubtedly, is how what we were seeing there was that the formulation of this grammatics, let's say, of the exclusion of bodies that didn't really matter, what it caused was production of global fear. And here is the most important aspect. And so it homogenized the experience of danger, while also the inequality was deepened in terms of protecting life. And I think this is very substantive from the eugenics project, right? How bodies are managed, how death is managed as well. So from here, I would like to think about the record or the track of this pendulum, and maybe why not to focus on a classification that is closed, even though we know, for example, that right-wing authoritarianism tend to be focused on nationality and sovereignty and the eternal enemy, etc. But in the second case, when we're talking about progressist governments and projects, it becomes harder to name. Actually, there is a resistance to name them. But these language, technocratic language or humanitarian language, still they manage the danger and the harm. They prioritize resources, and as well they can decide which are the recoverable lives. So I think this is important for us to get out of the ideological explanation, let's say, and instead get closer to the project, just as Sergio is proposing. And I think that is definitely relevant. So how can we move with this question and then see how all of this can be reinstalled in this movement or moment of geopolitical reconfiguration? We can see this language when it's authoritarian versus when it's humanitarian. And from that logic, from that rationale, I would like to also maybe provide an approach about my most recent work in terms of forced disappearances in Mexico. This applied to young people and how I am linking this to the dimension and the vision of eugenics. So for me, disappearance is not just a criminal activity, but instead is also a way of management that is of life. In this moment in Mexico, there is an average of 133,000 disappeared people. Most of them are young people, men from between 15 to 29 years old that are usually recruited for organized crime. And in Jalisco, in the state where I live and where I work, there are 16,000 disappeared people. Also, most of them are young people between 15 and 24 years old. So this is terrible, of course. And so in my work and in the follow-up that I provide, that is not just based on ethnography and in trying to find bodies, and also of course the mothers are really looking for their child, just as Javier Cecilia calls them, that he stopped being a poet actually after his son was killed in Cuernavaca. He says that these mothers that are seekers, they are the last moral reserve of this country. And I think that this is definitely something very strong to say, but also there are case files, there are also testimonies and confessions that, of course, can be seen, and they're terrifying because we see precisely how this logic of disappearance is focused on that eugenics device, let's say. So in a judicial case file, I would just like to share this with you. In a case file of appearances that it's not necessarily disappearances where you cannot really explain this horror. There was a Hyundai Volkswagen van and it was abandoned near one of the book fairs. That is one of the most important ones in December. There, it had around 8 to 10 dismembered bodies, and it was abandoned in a street that has actually a lot of people in there. So when one of the people responsible for this was arrested, this person confessed that in order to kidnap those that were going to be delivering this message, they would look for young people that would look like them. And this is definitely impressive because this is talking once again about what I am talking, the subject that is beyond himself. And these are people, these are young people that usually are deceived, they are seduced, they are trained at the end of the day in extermination camps and training camps. And so what happens is that they get rid of their own humanity. I didn't really want to use the word this objectivization to get it out of the psychology center, but instead now they are thinking, for example, about how there is a dimension where this person, this subject, is isolated from itself. And I think that this is definitely brutal, right? So my proposal, and what I think as well, is that we can also think about forced disappearances not just once again as a criminal action or a criminal activity, but also as a management of life and death, following Membe, for example, and his necropolitical, his necro policy. I actually call it necro machine. That is a machine of production and of death and management of life. And I think that this is something that is operating actually very strongly from the United States all the way to Argentina. And we can see that also with Bukele's prison. We see that also in Venezuela. These ways of managing bodies that are in the way, that are not correct, that are not adequate. And finally, I think it is also very relevant to think how all of these ways of eugenics end up building up some type of archive that can be managed. That is to say, there are lives that are that can be sacrificed. There are others that are worth remembering. But fundamentally, what we have is that we have bodies that are available, let's say, whether that is for the work of the extermination machinery, or also for them to also be used as guinea pigs, let's say, or people over which you or somebody can exercise control. And of course, to be able to use this narrative of how bad they end up being for civilized societies. So I would just like to close now with an idea that has been following me in my work, also with as Hugh, with a great philosopher of fear after the position or the stance of Descartes. But Hume, he is actually providing an anthropologic vision or perspective, because what he is saying is that emotions, fears, for example, ones that they are exacerbated, and the power and the media, and of course the literature that Sergio is talking about, and the movies and the movie theaters, etc. Everything is contributing to be able to build what Hume is calling the attribution object. And the attribution object is precisely that subject, that practice, that independently of its ideological condition, is trying to build as an internal enemy, that is from the power. We're seeing that in the United States very clearly with the interventions of ICE that are brutal, and of course how there are citizens, American citizens, that are very convinced that this is a correct practice, this brutality that is happening over these populations, right? So in this sense, I would mention that the challenge is not just in recognizing the difference, just as Durain was proposing in 1987, but also how are we going to be able to get rid of these factors that decide what lives are going to be taken care of and which of them are going to be suspended. I think that is totally fundamental. I think this is a challenge ethically, politically as well. And I think that the critical thought that has been cited by some of this authoritarian logics in eugenics as well, more than ever, it needs to generate a knowledge that can actually advocate socially speaking. And I think that this is very, very strong. Once again, I repeat, my optimism right now is really not enough for me to be able to imagine a future where these factors stop operating. So I would leave it there, and maybe we can contribute afterwards in the discussion. So thank you very much, and I will still be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rossana. So we will now move into the comments of Milton Reynolds. Milton, the idea is we're going to have around 20 minutes after listening to Sergio and Rossana. And afterwards, I would like to open some time so that our panelists can interact with whatever your comments may be. And then we can open for a Q&A session for the rest of the audience. No creo que me tome 20 minutos, pero voy a dar mis comentarios.
Between the conversations that we've been having over the course of the week, with the purpose of perhaps front-loading the conversations that we'll have moving forward. What are the themes that remain salient, and how do we use them as a way of sort of thinking about the work that is in front of us? Thinking about the work that is in front of us, is that better? So, Sergio's comments are a little bit in the deep end for me in terms of a lot of the sort of background knowledge. But what I did pull out of it is this notion that we've gone from science fiction into a transition into a different reality. Like the speculation of the future is now what we're living through, and that is a technological imposition. Living in the Bay Area, in Silicon Valley, it's been fascinating to watch what appeared to many to be a very progressive, forward-looking reality that was supposed to bring abundance to everybody and more equality, very quickly morph into a malignant and controlling sort of techno-authoritarianism. I think, I was thinking about this just yesterday. Zuckerberg's work, Move Fast and Break Things, actually resonates very deeply, right? The moving fast moves us beyond our sort of relational connection into sort of a constantly responding to a reality that is typically mediated through technological devices. The invitation is that our lives would get better and it would bring us closer, but in fact, it's actually left us fractured and operating in communities in which we don't have access to each other in a way that would make our concerns, our aspirations, our imagination something tangible and possible. Some of you have seen, I'm sure, the series Black Mirror that sort of puts forth this future, and the reality is we're living in it right now. And the question is, how do we, as a community of people who are interested in an anti-eugenic future, begin to reclaim or hold on to our humanity and imagine something that gives us access to each other in a way that allows us to shape a future that at this point is very difficult to control. I think the speed and pace of what's happening, not to mention it being undergirded by a tremendous, or I'd rather say a vulgar amount of wealth, is a really daunting process. Having said that, in an anti-eugenic future, what we do know is that we're smarter as a collective. So how do we, again, gain access to each other so that we can begin to reimagine what is possible rather than being constantly reacting to what is being imposed upon us? And I think that that's worth contemplating. Another theme that comes up is change and continuity and framing. I think oftentimes, I think this discussion started a couple days ago. We oftentimes, in doing the work, we break it down into binaries, whether that's positive or negative eugenics, soft or hard eugenics, as an analytical tool that gives us the opportunity to categorize things and as a way of understanding them. But increasingly, as this week goes on, I'm beginning to wonder about, are those binaries actually a liability? Because what we find from a historical perspective is eugenics is a bipartisan project. It lives very comfortably on the left and on the right. And to the extent that we position ourselves as being one or the other, we may lose sight that we may be actually involved in replicating some of the same sets of ideas that we are seeking to confront. So that's a challenge, and I think that's a challenge that will be with us for a while, but I think it's worthy to take up and to hold together as we navigate this conversation. Another theme that comes up, or maybe it's been sort of under the surface, is really thinking about eugenics as an economic philosophy, right? One that designates whose bodies are worthy, whose bodies are worthy of being saved, whose bodies are worthy of accessing resources. And I think about this sort of sci-fi future, this imaginary sort of re-amalgamation of whiteness in which the resources continue to get sucked up to a smaller and smaller, more homogeneous group of peoples. And living in the Silicon Valley, it's easy actually to see that taking place front and center and see how that process has actually fractured communities and communities' ability to respond. So whether that's the creatives, whether that's people who are trying to resist, the ability to have proximity to each other is actually deeply minimized by the economic asymmetries of this sort of technological imposition. It also brings me around to this notion of sort of AI and how, artificial intelligence is itself a parasitic technology, and how it feeds off our work, but in some cases reconstitutes it in a way that divorces us from its origins and how it was constructed in the first place. And I think about the inability to situate one's thought in a context, which is actually part of that eugenic project, which is one of abstraction. How do we sort of remove what is happening from the causative factors that are shaping that? And as that happens, that makes it very difficult to respond to it in a way that's meaningful. Sort of moving on to Rosanna's comments, I was sort of thinking a lot about this COVID and how that really created an opportunity and a challenge for us. We saw during the COVID pandemic, both on the local front in the United States, but also on a global level, how a vulgar racial triage happened in many ways. in some cases very explicitly determining who should or should not receive medical care, who had access to the vaccines. But it also allowed impositions of different natures, new experiments to happen in ways that, again, reify certain bodies as disposable and others as valuable and worth saving. This notion of disappearance is an actually really interesting one to me as a management of bodies. I think about it in a more historical sense as a carceral project. How do you sort of think about the current carceral state with the historic eugenic practices of isolation, be those in different kinds of institutions in which those bodies were purposed for production, as a function of being pathologized as unworthy, and how we think about the current carceral state as an extension of that, but also thinking about what's happening certainly on the ground in the United States in terms of these ICE sort of raids and these expulsionary commitments that are deeply part of the eugenic logic that have become normalized through the construction of the other. And thinking about the media, the move fast and break thing to me is really important, because one of the things that was fractured very deeply was our media ecosystem. It's not to suggest that it was always equal or fair or offered full representation, but we did have a relatively singular story that we had access to. And that story allowed us to formulate communities in response to what we had as some sense of shared understanding. I think it's very, very difficult to find that shared understanding right now. And it's important to understand that in many ways, these technological tools are what is fracturing our capacity to sort of inhabit a similar story. And I think in the absence of that similar story, it's very difficult to mobilize. And so we have to think together about how we create relational ecosystems that allow us to transcend the limitations of the current media environment. The mainstream media itself is a problem. Right now, in many ways, it's complicit with some of the eugenic narratives in ways that make it very difficult to situate oneself as part of a community of response. And so these are real challenges to us. But I do think our capacity as a collective, I mean, that's where our strength is, our ability to sort of use our shared perceptions to understand more critically what's happening. And that requires, a certain sensitivity to how we're able to sort of inhabit and hold each other's stories, but also a willingness to share our stories in a way that gives us a different grasp on, and perhaps an escalator to possibility, or to reclaim our imaginations is maybe a better way of saying it. Let's see. Trying to think, there was another theme that I wanted to pull on from the week, but I think the word community did come up quite a bit yesterday, and I think it's important to sort of imagine that maybe communities and how do we form them. I suspect that in some ways we can use some of the tools. I think the very nature of this gathering is a reflection of using some of the technologies to formulate communities across time and space. I think about the work of, from small beginnings and some of these projects that started years ago. And in many cases, for the first time, I'm seeing some of you in person, even though we've been in conversation for long periods of time. And so I think that has value, but I don't think it's a substitute for being in a room together. I think the affective dimensions of our communication that happen when we're in a shared space is fundamentally deeper and richer, and I think gives us a better sense of understanding. Now, it doesn't mean that we can always do that, but I think to the extent that we can strive to do that and create both smaller and larger sort of ecosystems that remain connected is what's going to allow us to be responsive and hopefully at some point proactively beginning to drive a conversation. As long as we're reactive, we're going to be spending a lot of energy. Now, that doesn't mean that we can afford to dismiss a response to some of the harms that are being generated. I know that that's come up quite a bit. The harms are many and they're broad base, and so we do have to attend to those. But I think our attention to the harms can't come at the expense of our ability to imagine what it looks like after the fever breaks, for lack of a better word. when I say that, I'm talking in some ways very specifically about the United States, but as we know that, when the United States sneezes, everybody else gets a cold. And so we have to sort of think about what the role of the United States is sort of in this project. But I do sense on the ground that there is some possibility of a fracture on the horizon. It's an inclination at this point, but I do sense that the kinds of fears being perpetrated and the broad-based nature of the harms allows us to reconfigure the narrative of eugenics, which I think has been part of our problem. I know Alex Stern was probably one of the first scholars whose work I read that actually critically sort of confronted the declension narrative, the idea that eugenics was something in our past. And I think it provided a sense of comfort to some, but it came at a tremendous expense because eugenics has been actually operating out in front and in ways that have become normalized. The other challenge of that is moving, I think, our conversations away from eugenics as an accusation to eugenics as an analytical lens. I know that some of that is sort of tied into particular American sort of dynamics, although I suspect it can be entirely unique to the United States. But this notion of the value of sort of interrogating eugenics in many cases, I'd say maybe in some activist spaces, is to accuse somebody else of being that, therefore relieving oneself of being sort of responsible for those things. And so I think what we might also contemplate in our time together is how do we begin to think about eugenics as an analytical lens to talk about not only the present and the past, but the relationship between the past and the future that's being imposed on us through these technological authoritarian sort of mechanisms and impositions. And so I think that's about it. The other thing I just want to acknowledge is the importance of being in conversation as a collective. And so would love to try to find some ways to have more time for this sort of Q&A amongst ourselves with the speakers, the presenters, and so on and so forth. And so, with that said, I guess I'll see my time and let's see where it goes.
Gracias.
Thank you, Milton, for your reflection based on what was shared by Sergio and Rossana. I would like to ask you, both Rossana and Sergio, if you have any question, any comment regarding what was commented by Milton based on your presentations. Rossana, go ahead. I think all the comments are quite interesting. Thank you so much. It makes me think about a number of things. I would like to go back to something mentioned by Sergio at the beginning of his intervention to connect it with certain aspects also commented by Milton, which is the idea of the contemporary imperial reason. I think that's what we are fighting against right now. And I believe that our commentator really went to the bullseye. This authoritarian project of control over life it's really hard to fight it from face to face. We cannot just move directly into fighting to it. So many things that are happening in Latin America and in other latitudes is what I could call the micropolitics. Small spaces of resistance that, without big mobilizations, are taking back ways of articulation and conviviality. They are resisting these logics of control. But most importantly, I like to think that these are spaces of imagination, of deep imagination. A book is about to be released, I think, in March. It's a book written between Lina Peña and I, which is the flight of I say it's about catastrophe, and we bring back the idea of Pasolini about this in this night that we are of the fireflies, the light there are small lights that shine and are somehow a north where we can go in order to wave a new fabric. I think that what we need is we have to go back to the core in order to articulate ourselves as humanity. And on that regard, I think about what Milton was mentioning in two ways. One that I'm really concerned, which is the idea, and we were talking this with Sergio before the start of this panel. Right now, the desperation of social mobilization because of all these fears that are so strongly installed, and this going back to private spaces in order to avoid confrontation. I am really concerned because of that. But on the other hand, this opens an important window. The last work of this scholar, Emily Louise Pratt, a Canadian, but living for a long time in the United States, when she talks about futurity and planetary logics, the planetary logic that Mary is managing or that she's using is quite strong in terms of how we see that there are some new emergences of hope, thinking future not as a destiny but as a possibility of construction. And we are now seeing it very clearly in the installation of another speech, of another narrative, a very powerful one, which is the interspecies care, and that has to do with the idea of the planetary logic where we are all part and where we all have a place. So thanks for the comments. I take a couple of things to think about, Milton. The idea, also the artificial intelligence as parasitic technology. That's an interesting idea, and I would like to go back to what you call pathologized bodies in a moment, in a moment in the days we are living. Currently, in this idea of pathologization. Thank you. Hello, I will just comment quite briefly. I agree with all the emphasis, all the highlights made by Milton. They are indeed important. I would like to just say that I might be doing a quite negative diagnose. The first intellectual aspect is we need to create a map according to the variables we are bringing together. Considering what we are facing right now. An interesting aspect that I think it's relevant to consider is that Department of State in the United States published a picture of a woman that was protesting in Minneapolis, but the picture that was published by the Department of State, the official picture of the United States, it's an altered picture produced by artificial intelligence. And this is what in 2017, under the first government of Trump, was called alternative facts. When Trump was saying that Trump was saying, "Oh, I took office, and this was the most important moment," and people in the world will say, "No, it was not important. There was barely any people there." So he was just stating alternative facts, and this was theorized as post-truth. But the main consequence of this has not to do just with a relativism, with an epistemological relativism. It has to do with the common experience as a foundation of policies, because common experience is a political aspect. It's sharing orientations, sharing perspective. Hannah Arendt said this before when she was talking about lies in politics, and she was talking about precisely the importance of media as a system that helps or that helps to create narratives within politics. So here there was a displacement of the reality of politics and the public. And Hannah Arendt talks about the destruction of public domain and therefore appropriated by the alt-right or by other forces. I think this is an important variable to take into account. And also the relation between planetary condition, this book, it's called Planetary Longings. The planetary condition and community aspect apparently go in separate ways, and yet they are not separate ways. And I'm going to say this before going to the Q&A. I think that now more than ever it's relevant what Aquile Mendes calls earthly community, because it's about thinking in micropolitics, and I totally agree with that. It's also understanding that these micropolitics are not fragmented, they constitute a planetarization of the culture. And this is the intellectual moment of these days. It's not just thinking about an identitarianism perspective or a pre-modern idea of community, but thinking about an planetary community that lets us understand that yes, indeed, the catastrophe has occurred many times. Viveiros de Castro said that the end of the world was experienced by the Mayans during the 15th century. The difference is that the current end of the world is not just the end of the world for a Western culture, it's the end of the planet itself, and that's a fundamental difference. So, confronted with this regime of finitude promised by the technological extinction of the contemporary logic, with this military logic, military technological logic, it's not enough to just give self-referenced answers. Right now, we need to find communication links to create a planetary politics, an alternative one that was to the one that was imposed through techno-capitalism in the current days. And that demands a lot of conversation, not protagonism. It demands a lot of conversation, a lot of listening, because we need to create everything from scratch.
About this idea of mapping our realities. And I think because these racialization projects are context specific, it's actually essential that we're able to understand each other's context. There may be some crossover and some universal patterns, but these projects are always distinct because they're transacted through policies and practices, and those need to be understood in context. And it's through the sort of teasing out of the nuance that I think we gain a better understanding and stand a better chance of resisting and responding in a way that may allow us to create a future where all of our lives are valued, all of our bodies are valued, and we're all contributing to something that benefits us collectively as well as the planet. Because the other thing is, as we're on the menu as human beings, so is the planet. In this sort of techno future, the planet is burnt up. So we have to that may offer us a possibility of organizing around, responding to climate change may be a mechanism through which we can actually link the human crisis with the planetary crisis. So it's just something that has just recently emerged, but I'll leave it at that and look forward to the Q&A.
Gracias. Bueno, quisiera subir un...
Before moving into the Q&A session and the comments of the audience, from what was shared during the panel, maybe this idea of right wing, left wing, it's definitely limited if we do not not make a cross section with other aspects. It's like a Cartesian order between human rights, democracy, that it's moving back or holding itself back in the face of autocracies, dictatorships. I think about what Sergio was mentioning about Heidegger and rather than feasibility, the possible responses from micropolitics or social spaces. I keep thinking about these utopic ideas. Like, we need to build utopias, but utopias were created 150 years ago, where the new man emerged, like the new human being. But the new human being somehow speaks of another kind of exclusion, and also from a perspective of new political organization that was located in the lefts, in the socialist democracies, and eugenic practice were present even during the 1970s in spaces like Scandinavian cultures. And of course, what is happening in Latin America, in Mexico, for example, in the state of Guerrero, in the southern part of Mexico, this control policies of childbirth that we're looking forward to create a fittest society from the perspective of power. So from that point of view, the only thing that keeps revolving in my mind is the idea, also considering these utopias that we need to build. What if collectivity or the planetary perspectives are not ready, or if they are ready to learn from their mistakes while aligning to eugenics, maybe not from the right wing, but in this idea of a fittest human race to inhabit the world? I don't know how to put it across in a better way, but well, I have a lot of questions. A lot of things going through my mind, but I would like to listen to you. We here are going to make a Q&A session, a round of 3 questions, so that Sergio, Rossana, and Milton can answer. So if you can tell us your names. Thank you. I am Alberto Guerrero. Thank you so much, all of you, for your ideas, all the ideas that you're sharing with us. This was a very interesting panel. And a question for Rossana. I find not just interesting but important what you are doing, your research. I would like to ask you if you have found an ethnical profile, specifically in the case of forced disparition, or if it's an economical profile, and on that perspective, are you interested in the relationship between these processes of forced, or these mechanisms of forced disparition, as a mechanism, as maybe not an anomaly, but actually part of the very logic of the economical powers within our country? And to Sergio, I find quite interesting this what you say about this ontological racism in the Western society. Throughout these days, the concept of race has been mentioned over and over. I was wondering if you consider it convenient that we, from academia or from scholar movements or from our place, should we start moving beyond the concept of race, something that has been done in philosophy of biology, anthropology, biology itself, because it's an old concept that it doesn't represent a natural kind. It's more a social construct. Would it be convenient for us? I think this is something quite installed in the in the in the global north. There are many voices reacting to the idea of race, so I would like to know what you think about it. Thank you. I'm Pietra. Thanks for the presentations. I was taking notes and I have a number of insights. I'm going to be brief with my comment and the question. I couldn't stop thinking about the logic of the Independence Act that says that it's necessary to pursue happiness, and the idea of pursuing happiness was written in a moment where that country was moving through a process of slavery of people who were displaced from Africa. And at the same time, that act was an example for North American imperialism, and it inspired other nations in its concept of liberty, democracy. So my comment is, with liberalism that was developed throughout the 20th century and all this accelerationism of Silicon Valley in the capitalist, dual capitalist system, maybe us, we're going to come from this liberal system with scarcity as an essential part of it, and the eugenic dispositives were part of the equipment, were part of the apparatus support, so that the radical capitalism could flourish. So, thinking on this logic, right wing, left wing in eugenics, where do we I mean, we call ourselves progressive, but because we don't have the courage to say that we are left wing, because the fear of saying, okay, you are, once you say you're left wing, you are totally associated with socialism. Also, you want an authoritarian socialist state. That's there's a fear there. So where do we go with these micro communities? We're going to live in a dystopian system that is going to be created by this accelerationist from Silicon Valley, that is going to be created through these violences, or are we going to accept a future that will try to disconnect or destabilize that possibility of a new system? Are we going to create a new system? We're going to live within a new way, a new system that comes from below, or as Eduardo Viveros mentioned, Otto Krenak, and when he talks about the possibility of an ancestral future where we look towards original peoples who survived the end of the world, and there they are. So, well, those are my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you for this amazing panel. It has been really nice to listen and hear from you. Even though I would like to say a few things, I actually would like to keep hearing from you. So I am just going to ask a question to Rossana. And this is actually linked to the question that the first person was asking. I think the work that you're doing is very important and also what you have presented. But I would like probably to just ask for conceptual clarification, or I don't know if maybe you could talk a little bit more about it in terms of why you are choosing to name the violence processes that we are going through in Mexico as eugenic processes. I mean, what is the aspect that would allow them to characterize them that way instead of using a different word? You used necropolitics many times, and finally, you were defining it as that management of populations and that management of life and death, right? But then, what would be the boundary between necropolitics and, eugenics, or all necropolitics? Is eugenics, are they synonyms or not? I mean, I just have a little bit of a question about that. Thank you. Then we will close with this round, and we can move now to the responses and some of the content and comments. Rossana, do you want to start? Your microphone is off. Okay, well, thank you very much for the interventions and also for the questions. Alberto, yes, there is actually an economic profile and an ethnical profile. So after we have analyzed the disappearances, I mean, there are exceptions, of course. There are kidnappings. Levantones are called in Spanish in Mexico, which is a horrible word. There are kidnappings, there's forced disappearances, and also with people or stakeholders in accumulated economic sectors, but that is very rare. What I have done is to generate through AI, actually, to include all of these files of people that have disappeared and run them, but then not see them with technology, but instead with a visual semiotic analysis. And what you can see very clearly is how some of these disappearances actually have to do with an origin or with an economic anchor, but at the same time it has an ethnical profile, anthroformed profile of the subject of this life that doesn't matter. We have very important cases, for example, of what Javier Cecila is calling the exemplar victims. And so it refers to those victims that manage to have a national visibility, let's say, and then people react very strongly to them. And then they are demanding them to appear. There is a media pressure also in the social media as well. And so these exemplar victims have or reach a visibility that actually most of the victims don't really reach, right? So there you can see very clearly how we have this expression, and maybe we could call it that it's logic of management of prescindable or disposable bodies. And so in that sense, what I have been working on since 2011, around there, first I had a concept that I called narco machine, and that was to be able to articulate the relationship between the political power, the economic power, but it stopped being, I mean, it's still functioning, but it stopped being operational as much as violence processes were accelerated and also cruelty. And so around 2018, actually in Princeton, where we met physically the last time with Sergio, hopefully we will have another chance to do that. And so I coined this concept of necro machine, and that is also in Membe's work. But I want to take this to a much more anchored record, let's say anthropologically, in what is happening in the territory. So necro machine allows me to think about body, territory, control, and destruction of the self. And so that is something that really keeps me busy, trying to generate these categories to think about this idea. And Well, yes, the second intervention that actually has a little bit more to do with what Sergio was mentioning. Well, that is also related to technology acceleration and happiness and all of this, and what regime we're going to be living under, or what logic. And so that made me think about the techno-feudalism book about that wrote Janis Varoufakis. And so I think it's very interesting. I'm not very sure that I actually share her perspective. I think I have a few questions, but I do think that the core argument of Varoufakis is actually interesting, as in a way that is placing the big ones, like the huge tech actors and all of these platforms and all of these companies, digital companies, it's placing them as like the new feudalists, that they are not necessarily controlling the territory, but they are controlling the imaginaries. So I think that in that sense, that is relevant, and it has to do with some of the things that Milton actually has talked about in his two interventions. It has to do with how controlling or generating or producing imaginaries on the one hand can squash the emerging social imaginary, but at the same time, on the other hand, it creates a lot of docility. And also thinking about Beatriz, well, I remember that there was a table with Mabel Moraña, and so she was saying very interestingly, Patrisario, that with imaginaries are not to be discussed or contradicted. And I think that that is the big challenge of how we can get out of this situation. And finally, undoubtedly, when I'm talking about the necro machine and necropolitics, and I am talking about them as contemporary way to manage bodies, deaths, and lives, this is not just eugenic. I mean, yes, of course, undoubtedly there is logic of production, of profit that is very clear. So this is not just mounted on an eugenic device, let's say, but also from a capitalist device as well. So undoubtedly, organized crime that feeds our supplies from these disposable bodies, that is transforming from victims to aggressors, because I think that is also a very important transition as well. I'm very interested in understanding that and discussing it. That is anchored in a logic of profit accumulation and capital. So we need to understand it from that perspective. So there are not synonyms. I don't think that necropolitics and eugenics are the same thing, but instead, let's say that they are expressions. I don't know if maybe this is not the right way to describe it, but these are expressions of control devices or control mechanisms that have a historic origin and a sociocultural articulation of a big data. I mean, that is really what we're fighting against. I don't really know if I was clear enough, but anyway, I will leave my intervention there. Thank you. No, yes, I think that is super clear. And I would even say that the project, the biopolitical, is also opening to biopolitics per se as a population. And the other one is the anatom politics that actually has to do with much more racialized way of exercising power. So yes, I do agree, Rossana, that eugenics is one of the mechanisms or devices among many others in terms of modeling and formalizing life, because the material data is actually part of it. And I say this because I would like to respond the first question in terms of the pertinence of the concept of race. Yes, of course, that is totally deconstructed. It has been questioned even by the Charter to the United Nations, etc. But the thing here is that we have context, specific context where words can have some relevant semiotics. So, for example, we're using the category of critical race theory in the North American context, and that is supposing to include in the humanistic curriculum based on the Western values that, of course, are white. And so it's supposed incorporation of what that curriculum itself erased historically. So when we're talking about that, this is not just in terms of naive ways of thinking about race, but also the constitutive rationalization of the Western humanist project. So in that sense, and I don't think that the word is race. I mean, yes, of course, that has been deconstructed and questioned, etc. But I don't think it can just be dismissed. However, I think that this is a very good question, because you could use race naively, and with that you can keep fostering that misunderstanding. And I think that what is needed is not necessarily to work with general categories, but instead with specific processes. And so in that sense, more than race, what matters is the practice of rationalization. That is precisely what the ethnographic analysis is doing, and also critical and political. So it's working with specific scene and not with transcendentals. And so that is another teaching from Foucault. So yes, I totally agree. In terms of race, that doesn't really go beyond. But we're talking about rationalization processes, because deep down, what is something that we need to think about is what is human, the boundaries that that has, the formulations. I mean, these are conjugations. And I think that that is precisely what is in question, and not just against the white supremacists, right, and the project of the manifest destiny of American imperialism, but also with Caesarean terms and with transhumanist, post-humanist, etc., because this is the matter of questioning that. And that allows for me to respond to the second aspect from Alton Grenak. I think that opens this idea of alternative odontologists, and it cannot be more important nowadays to open to that type of thought. And I think that the work that we would need to do is to oppose techno-futurism or archaeofuturism of the right wing, the ancestral future. I think that is the work that needs to be done. That work is a writing, reading work of production of concept, because there is a substantive difference. Mostly because the idea of the ancestral future is not represented in the realization of a monolithic, self-transparent community that is also monochromatic, but instead is the radicalization of how you are in the world. And look, it's not the notion of community in the naive idea, but instead is what you have in common. More than community is about being in the world with something in common. So it's put into practice in terms of communities that are articulated in contingencies and fights. I always remember the case of Julius Scott, who is an Afro-American scholar from Michigan that wrote the most important thesis about revolution in Haiti, and also the hearsay, right? How can you do that? There is no record, there is no police matters, and still he was capable to question some of the sources at the time to be able to see how the news from Europe would come here, and they would then produce the hearsay or the rumor of a possible revolution, and how that created a community that actually is the one that was for the revolution in Haiti. So this is not the black race, in quotes, as it would be traditionally referred to, but instead is an act community, and that is what I would be interested in thinking. And I think that the concept that I would be using is precisely, I mean, because I think it's not enough to recover it, what Milton was mentioning. This moment before technology was better than now, but it was not ideal. I mean, we need to also go beyond that as well. It's not just a matter of going back to that model. I think that now more than ever, communism is the only alternative, but that is the issue. If I say communism, everybody's scared. I am talking about dirty communism, because unlike communism that is converted into state philosophy or historic philosophy that supposes the realization of the man as part of the future. And dirty communism instead is this idea that we are always in the world once and others together, that we are always materially included in this community, and that what we need to do is to erase the individualistic aspects and open to these common sense. And so that is where the question of common and communism can be looked at. So this is actually the idea that we are in the world together, once with others. And in that sense, we also need to be able to empower an analysis, resistance, strategy, and fight as well, so that we can be able to go against the capital. So I think that is the core idea. I am not afraid to say that I am left-wing or progressist. I think that is just not enough nowadays to say that. And we actually need to be a lot more radical, and that is what is happening. But at the same time, we cannot just wait for this to be created with some philosopher or somebody that is enlightened. This is happening, and we need to be able to read it in the world. It's like the true exception of the state. It's not something that will come, but instead, unlike the fascism, this is a new relationship to the historic practices. That is what it's at stake, to have a new relationship with history beyond the law of how it is parsing. And then probably I can leave my intervention there. Thank you. Okay, so we have 10 minutes left. We are going to have another round of questions. I would just like to ask you to have short participation so that we can have time still to get the answer. So back there, please. And afterwards, over here. Okay, well, first of all, I would just like to also congratulate you for the seriousness and how pertinent this panel is. And I would also like to celebrate the interventions from Rossana and from Sergio as well, that I thought were very accurate. Marina Garces talks about critical imagination as a way of renaming or resetting boundaries in the front, in the face of an external world that most of the time can surprise us with its hypertrophies. But it says that a stance that is totally apocalyptic actually is affecting the critical imagination. It affects or harms that possibility for critical imagination. However, I think that a serious analysis, and of course I totally agree, Sergio, that for us to start speaking, we need to do at least the diagnosis of the atrocity. But you and also Rossana, you were both talking about imagination, and about imagination as a way to face what is to come afterwards, right? So I would just like to probably ask you to maybe help us or help me think about also what is the place of imagination also at the core of obsolete humanities or obsolete social sciences that we can see in university contexts or environments, because maybe we also could rethink this as a whole. Thank you. And then over here, please. Thank you very much. My name is Susana Anteri. Thank you to the presenters, Sergio, Rossana, Milton. All of this has been really very interesting. My question actually is to Sergio, because I was thinking about some of your ideas in terms of science fiction and these sort of line or timeline of the bad science fiction, and also techno-racism and current fascism, and this idea of speculative whiteness, and a little bit also of that idea that in that line, in the current science fiction and that type of speculation, racist speculation, there is a way to erase, the idea of the repressed origin. And I was thinking, or I was wondering, to what extent would it be useful or interesting to think about this line of science fiction historically as well? Because what I'm thinking is that also in previous times, to science fiction, and I'm thinking specifically by the end of the 19th century with new technologies, there was also this concurrence between racism that was directed to whiteness, and also at the same time the speculation or the desire for new futures. But I am thinking that even at those moments, somehow the racialized body is still needed. That is to say, that is not just disappearing from that scheme. So I wonder if somehow in the most current lines that you're analyzing for a speculative whiteness, that of course there is certain structure, right, that still depends or relies on racialized bodies that are not desired in that futurism. So what would be the dynamic there in terms of reciprocity or need between the desired body of whiteness versus the bodies that are rejected under this scheme? Thank you. Thank you. One last question. Okay, then we can start with the responses, I think. The last interventions then. Thank you. Go ahead, Sergio. Okay. Well, okay, perfect. And then Rossana is going to be closing. Well, what a surprise that Susana and Leonor are there. Leonor, I totally agree that imagination is actually the most important thing. I have a deformation of philosopher, and I would say that this is precisely about thinking of imagination as something that could be potential before it actually becomes as a skill. And for example, from Heidegger, when he talks about metaphysics, and when Heidegger is considering how the first Kant from the pure reasoning critique is very radical in terms of the statutes of imagination that can be ambiguous, but afterwards he rewrites that critique in version B, and then it is also applying that to the skill of understanding, and that is some type of subordination. So it's almost as if he was regretting to that stable place that imagination has. And of course, I'm not saying that imagination needs to be thought as philosophically, but instead what I'm saying is that in the more structural speech, that imagination already has a very important function in a way that it can also deorganize the economy of these skills. Now, in practice terms, because I wouldn't be interested in just making this theoretical, I think that yes, there is a lot of theory in imagination, and imagination is circulating as some type of antidote for everything. But there is also imagination of the right wing, just as people from 1968 said, imagination of the power. What we know, unfortunately, is that it took over the power, or power is incredibly imaginative. But yes, imagination is calling that structural openness that goes beyond facticity. What we were talking as a possibility would be precisely that projection of being in the world with somebody else. That is imagination, and that is perceived materially, of course, in practice. So for me, the core job or the core work is a topology of these imaginative practices as a condition for a possibility to really understand the resistant logics and dynamics, because I totally agree, there is no worse intellectual calling than what is referred to in the Western of the apocalyptic mystagogo. That is the one that is really talking and singing about the end of the times, which is late nihilism. And so that is the entire issue. This is not just a matter of overcoming nihilism, and I think that that is the main aspect. I am not interested in talking about the game over or the end of times, but instead I think the intention is to have these practical ways of surviving that always have a place. And in terms of what Susanna was talking about, and I think that work is fundamental in this context and also in this conference. There is always a rationalized subject because there are rationalization processes, but we also need to see the story of the gender of science fiction. For example, with the American tradition, the science fiction in the right wing is less meaningful, is lower in relation to the critical science fiction tradition. That is why I was talking about Octavia Butler, and that is one of the axes that probably we could take into consideration. Or even the discussions that Bolaño has in terms of science fiction, all of that is core to it. And so, in that sense, what I think makes science fiction relevant in terms of the right wing currently is that you can see there the political goal or of the new right. And I think that is the main thing. It's not necessarily that you don't have that imagination. Of course, we still need to think about that. And so that is why the response to Afrofuturists, to Afro-pessimists, has to go through recovering imagination for science fiction. But I think that the core aspect of the right-wing science fiction that is also reinforced technologically by Hollywood and all of these catastrophic imaginaries, that goes precisely through its convergence with a horizon that is neo-reactionary of transhumanists, especially those that understand the technological perspective not just from productivism, but also now as an enhancement, sort of, or as an empowerment of the human beyond the human, technologically speaking, once again. And so, in that sense, I think we need to radicalize the critique of this to show how this surplus theory, technologically speaking, can be applied to a precarious human body. But of course, we can also make a lot more remarks in that sense.
Very quickly, I think both interventions were quite relevant. And thinking about this outside and inside, what comes to my mind, what came to my mind right away was the book that was published by Jacobo Dayan and Javier Sicilia, that's called Crisis or Apocalypses, The Evils of Our Times, where what they're trying to say is to look for the origins of this idea of evil that's so embedded in the society. But there's also an optimistic aspect that both authors cover by the end of the book, which is a little bit of a religious aspect. Javier Sicilia is a Catholic guy, but it becomes a fundamental aspect, which is called the catechon. That is the idea of stopping or putting brakes to the damage. That is, okay, evil is there, the damage is there, but the work of the catechon that will be embodied on what Sergio calls practices, embodied in bodies that resist from the work I am conducting, it will be this work of tension in this end of the world. I believe this is quite strong because it brings us back to the idea of micropolitics that we know is not de-articulated. We know that there are a number of issues, but there are resistances that are fighting. So connecting the idea of the catechon and connecting the idea of the necromachine of my work, what I do is proposing the idea of counter machines, which are dispositives for resisting these machines of death in order to create an imagination fabric that is bringing into existence other possibilities, other worlds. Another concern is one in my work I called a heterotopic utopic space. In multiple interviews in Puerto Rico, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, I was able to understand how people build an idea of the topic space as that safe place where they can move around, where they can exist without many threats. And that space or those spaces are shrinking as time goes by. Following Michel Foucault, the other space, the space where monsters inhabit, the construction of this enemy. And maybe the most concerned thing at the level of imagination was this topic space where the imagination of the most privileged sectors and the less privileged sectors came together in terms of the generation of a future where where the utopic element, there won't be any distortion or any alteration of the order assumed as the order of oneself. And this was peculiar for me. And thinking about Lemebel, about the becoming black, or the black becoming of the world, he states as a big catastrophe the dimension of the savage capitalism. It has to do with how today, on a daily basis, we can be a black person, so to speak, in the sense that we can exclude it, exterminate it, and totally obliterate it as an identity. So these are not times for for optimism to flourish, but I think there are some elements that we can push forward in order to build these communities that Milton talked about and that were also mentioned by Sergio. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rossana, Sergio, Milton, for your participations. We close this panel, and in 25 minutes, we come back with Eugenics, media, and the construction of narratives on migration. Thanks for coming.